October 14th, 1847. Charlton Ridge Plantation, South Carolina. The moon hung low and red over the cotton fields like a wound in the sky, and in the grand house at the end of the oak-lined road, a decision was made that would curse a bloodline forever. Mistress Evangeline Ashford sat in her candlelit parlor, her pale hands trembling not with fear but with cold ambition, as she looked upon her three virgin daughters, Cecilia, Marguerite, and Beatrice, and spoke words no mother should ever utter. The Ashford name was dying. 3 generations of inbreeding among the planter elite had left the men of the family weak, sickly, prone to madness and early death. Evangeline's husband had died childless before her daughters were born. She had borne them in secret with a cousin, hoping to preserve the fortune, the land, the legacy. But the girls were fragile, beautiful, hollow vessels of aristocratic decay. Evangeline needed strength. She needed new blood. And so, in her twisted desperation, she turned her gaze to the quarters, to the man the overseers whispered about in fear and awe, Josiah, the blacksmith, the giant, the one they could not break. She would give him her daughters. She would breed a new Ashford line, one built on stolen power, on flesh and fire. This is not a story of love. This is a story of violation dressed as salvation, of a plantation mistress who believed she could bend the very laws of blood and bone to her will. But what Josiah carried in his veins was older than her greed, darker than her cruelty, and what he bred into those 3 girls would not be the salvation of the Ashford line, but its utter annihilation. If you're ready to descend into one of history's most haunting tales of reckoning and revenge written into the flesh itself, then stay with me. Subscribe, because you won't want to miss how this bloodline devoured itself from within. Charlton Ridge was a kingdom built on suffering. 500 acres of cotton stretched like a white ocean beneath the Carolina sun, tended by 200 enslaved souls whose names were recorded only in ledgers, whose lives were measured only in output. The Ashford family had ruled this land since 1782, when Evangeline's grandfather claimed it with money earned from the triangle trade: rum, slaves, molasses, blood. The main house stood 3 stories tall, white-columned and elegant, a monument to gentility that reeked of rot beneath its perfume. Inside, portraits of pale-faced ancestors lined the walls, their eyes following visitors with aristocratic disdain, their bloodlines so tangled that cousins married cousins, uncles wed nieces, all to keep the fortune intact, the name pure. But purity had become poison. Evangeline's own father had died raving at 42, convinced that spiders were hatching beneath his skin. Her brother had been born with a twisted spine and lived only 7 years. Her husband, selected from a neighboring plantation family equally inbred, had been impotent, prone to fits, dead before 30. The Ashford men were ghosts long before they entered the grave. And now Evangeline, at 48 years old, looked upon her 3 daughters, 17, 16, and 15, and saw the same frailty, the same hollow beauty that would crumble at the first strong wind. Cecilia, the eldest, had her mother's sharp features, but suffered from mysterious fevers that left her bedridden for weeks. Marguerite, the middle child, was prone to fainting spells and had never bled as a woman should. Beatrice, the youngest, was the most beautiful and the most broken. Her mind sometimes wandered into childish spaces, her laughter inappropriate, her eyes too wide. They were decorative, delicate, doomed. Evangeline knew that if she married them off to the neighboring planter families, the Ashford blood would simply continue its slow extinction in someone else's nursery. She needed something radical, something unthinkable. She needed to reach down into the dirt and pull up strength itself, no matter the cost, no matter the blasphemy. And so her eyes turned toward the forge, toward the man whose very existence was an act of defiance. Josiah was not born on Charlton Ridge. He had been purchased at auction in Charleston 5 years prior, brought in chains from a plantation in Georgia where he had killed an overseer with his bare hands. The story went that the overseer had taken a whip to Josiah's sister, had dragged her into the barn, and when Josiah found her afterward, broken, bleeding, silent, something ancient and terrible had awakened in him. He walked into the fields at noon, found the overseer among the cotton rows, and crushed his skull like a melon. They should have hanged him. But Josiah was too valuable, 6 feet and 7 inches tall, 260 pounds of pure muscle, capable of working the forge for 16 hours without rest, capable of shoeing horses, mending plows, crafting iron gates that would last a century. Plantation owners sold him south instead, and Evangeline Ashford purchased him for twice the normal price, seeing in his auction sheet not a dangerous criminal but a specimen of perfect physical power. Josiah had survived 5 years at Charlton Ridge by becoming stone. He spoke rarely. He obeyed without expression. He worked the forge from dawn until the stars emerged, his hammer ringing against anvil like a heartbeat, like a drum, like a promise. The other enslaved people both feared and revered him. He settled disputes with a word. He carried the sick to the healing woman. He never touched the whiskey rations, never took a woman, never smiled. The overseers left him alone because something in his eyes suggested that the violence in Georgia had not been exhausted, only buried, waiting. He was 32 years old and had never known freedom, but he carried himself like a king in exile, his body a temple built by suffering, his silence a kingdom the masters could not enter. Evangeline had watched him from her parlor window many times, had seen the way firelight painted his skin bronze and gold, had noted the perfect architecture of his shoulders, the way his hands, large enough to wrap entirely around a horse's hoof, moved with unexpected grace. She did not see a man. She saw a breeding stud. She saw salvation. She summoned him on an October night when the air was thick with the smell of burning cane fields and approaching winter. The house servants, 2 elderly women who had served the Ashfords for 40 years, were told to bring Josiah to the parlor after the evening meal, to have him washed and dressed in clean clothes. They obeyed, but their hands trembled as they prepared him, and they would not meet his eyes. Josiah knew that something unnatural was unfolding. Masters did not summon slaves to parlors. Masters did not request cleanliness and presentation unless the slave was to be sold, punished, or used in ways that required the pretense of civility. He entered the parlor at 8 o'clock. Evangeline sat in a high-backed chair upholstered in green velvet, her daughters arranged on a sofa like porcelain dolls, their white dresses glowing in the candlelight. The room smelled of lavender and old money. Josiah stood in the center of the Persian rug, his massive frame incongruous among the delicate furniture, and waited. Evangeline studied him as one might study a horse before purchase, assessing, calculating utterly without shame. Then she spoke, her voice cultured and cold, and the words she uttered were an abomination dressed in aristocratic syntax. She told him that the Ashford line was failing, that her daughters needed strong blood to survive childbirth, to produce healthy heirs, that he had been selected for his physical perfection, his proven vitality, his strength, that he would lie with each of her daughters in turn, that he would get them with child, and that those children would be raised as white as Ashford, the secret of their conception buried forever. In exchange, she would grant him a cabin of his own, better food, freedom from the fields, and the promise that any children he fathered would never be sold. She spoke of it as if she were proposing a business arrangement, as if the systematic rape of her own daughters by an enslaved man was simply an innovative solution to a bloodline problem. Josiah said nothing. His face remained stone, but inside something ancient stirred and sharpened itself like a blade. The 3 daughters sat frozen, their faces pale as moonlight, their hands folded in their laps like obedient ghosts. Not one of them spoke, not one of them protested. They had been raised in the suffocating tradition of Southern womanhood, silent, decorative, existing only to reflect their family's glory and produce its future. Their mother's word was law, their bodies were not their own, and the notion of refusal had been bred out of them as thoroughly as strength had been bred out of the Ashford men. Cecilia, the eldest, stared at the floor, her jaw tight, her breathing shallow. Marguerite's hands trembled slightly, the only sign of the terror coursing through her. Beatrice, the youngest, looked at Josiah with wide, uncomprehending eyes, her mind unable to grasp the full horror of what was being proposed. Evangeline continued speaking, outlining the arrangement with clinical precision. Josiah would be brought to each daughter's room on selected nights, determined by the moon and the rhythm of their bodies. The house servants would be sworn to secrecy on pain of sale or death. The overseers would be told that Josiah was performing special ironwork projects for the main house, explaining his late-night presence. Once the daughters were confirmed with child, the visits would cease. The babies would be born, their features explained away as throwbacks to some distant Mediterranean ancestor, some fictional Ashford foremother with dark hair and strong bones. The story would be polished, rehearsed, and made true through sheer aristocratic will. She spoke of it all without emotion, without acknowledging the monstrousness of what she proposed. In her mind, she was saving her family, preserving an empire, doing what hard necessity demanded. That she was offering her virgin daughters to a man they had been taught to view as property, that she was engineering a form of violence that had no name in polite society, that she was grafting slavery's cruelest logic onto her own bloodline, none of this registered as sin. She saw only solution, only survival, only the Ashford name continuing into the next century, no matter the cost. Josiah looked at the three girls, children really, despite their ages, and felt nothing resembling desire. He felt only the ancient familiar weight of being used, of having his body conscripted into another's design, of being reduced once again to function rather than humanity. But beneath that weight, something else was taking shape, a realization, an opportunity wrapped in degradation. Evangeline Ashford, in her desperation and arrogance, had just offered him a weapon she did not understand. She thought she was purchasing his seed to strengthen her bloodline. She did not realize she was inviting a wolf into the nursery, that she was allowing him to plant something far more dangerous than strong bones and healthy constitutions into her daughters' wombs. He had been taught by his grandmother back when he was a child in Virginia before the first sale, before the chain of owners and atrocities that had carried him to this moment. She had been a root woman, a keeper of old knowledge that predated the plantations, that stretched back across the ocean to places whose names were forbidden to speak. She had taught him that blood carries memory, that what a man puts into a woman is not just flesh but history, anger, resistance, the accumulated weight of ancestral spirits who do not forget and do not forgive. She had taught him that the children of violence carry violence forward, that trauma writes itself into bone marrow and passes down through generations like a curse or a blessing depending on who wields it. Evangeline thought she was breeding strength into her line, but Josiah knew what he would actually be breeding into these girls, the memory of every enslaved ancestor, every broken family, every child sold, every back-whipped, every spirit that had refused to be extinguished. He would put his body into theirs as commanded, but his soul would go with it, and his soul was not gentle, not forgiving, not interested in preserving the Ashford legacy. His soul was interested in ending it, slowly, from the inside. Through the very children Evangeline hoped would be her salvation. He finally spoke, his voice low and measured. "I understand, mistress." They brought him to Cecilia's room 3 nights later, when the moon was waxing and the house was silent except for the sound of autumn wind moving through the oaks. The room was decorated in shades of rose and cream, filled with the trappings of genteel girlhood, embroidered pillows, a vanity covered with perfume bottles, watercolor paintings of flowers on the walls. Cecilia sat on the edge of her bed in a white nightgown, her dark hair unbound, her face composed into a mask of aristocratic endurance. She had been prepared by her mother with clinical instructions, told to submit without resistance, to think of England or God or the family name, anything but the reality of what was about to occur. Josiah entered and closed the door behind him. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air heavier. He stood near the doorway, making no move toward her, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other across the space. Two people trapped in a nightmare neither had chosen, both conscripted into roles that violated something fundamental in the soul. Cecilia's composure began to crack. Her hands twisted in the fabric of her nightgown. Her breath came faster. She was 17 years old and had never been touched by any man, had been taught that her body was a sacred vessel to be surrendered only to a husband of equal social standing in the sanctified bond of marriage. Now she was being given to a slave in her childhood bedroom, and the cognitive dissonance was tearing her mind apart. "I won't hurt you," Josiah said quietly, and the unexpected gentleness in his voice broke something in her. She began to cry, silent tears that ran down her cheeks without sound, the crying of someone who has been taught that even grief must be performed with dignity. He moved toward her then, not with violence, but with a terrible, deliberate care, and what happened in that room over the next hour was not rape, in the way the overseers committed it in the quarters, with brutality and contempt. It was something more complex, more poisonous, a violation wrapped in false tenderness, orchestrated by a mother, endured by both, participants like a ritual sacrifice. Over the next 4 months, Josiah was brought to each daughter in rotation, the schedule determined by Evangeline's careful tracking of their cycles, her observations recorded in a leather journal she kept locked in her desk. Marguerite's room was decorated in shades of blue and silver, and she met him with a silence even deeper than her sister's, her body rigid as marble, her eyes fixed on the ceiling as if she could escape through force of will alone. She never cried, never spoke, simply endured with the grim determination of someone who had already decided that this version of herself, the one being used like livestock, was not real, was happening to someone else, somewhere else, in a story she would never claim as her own. Beatrice was different. Her room was pale yellow, filled with dolls and children's books she still read when the headaches came. She greeted Josiah with confused questions, asking why her mother had sent him, what they were supposed to do, whether this was a game or a lesson. Her innocence was a weapon that cut deeper than any scream. Josiah found himself speaking to her softly, telling her stories from his childhood, tales his grandmother had told him about a Nancy the spider, and how the small and clever could outwit the strong and cruel. She listened with wide eyes and eventually fell asleep against his shoulder, and he sat there in the candlelight holding this broken child woman and feeling the full weight of his own complicity settle into his bones like lead. But he did not stop. He could not stop. Refusal meant death, or worse, meant being sold deeper south to the sugar plantations where men died within 3 years, or to the breeding farms where he would be used this way with dozens of women until his body gave out. And beneath his revulsion, beneath his carefully maintained humanity, the cold purpose remained. Each time he lay with these girls, he whispered prayers his grandmother had taught him, old words in a language the masters had tried to erase, calling on ancestors to witness, to remember, to curse what was being built here. By February of 1848, all 3 daughters showed signs. Cecilia's morning sickness was violent and prolonged, leaving her bedridden and pale, unable to keep down even water. Marguerite's body swelled rapidly, her belly pronounced by the 3rd month, her ankles thick, her face puffy and unfamiliar in the mirror. Beatrice simply grew quiet, her childish mannerisms fading as something ancient and knowing settled into her eyes, as if the pregnancy had aged her a decade in a matter of weeks. Evangeline was triumphant. She brought in a discreet physician from Charleston, a man who owed the Ashfords money and silence, and he confirmed what she already knew. Her daughters were carrying strong, healthy children. The heartbeats were vigorous, the pregnancies progressing normally. Her plan was working. She moved Josiah back to the quarters, his purpose fulfilled, his proximity no longer necessary. She gave him the promised cabin, a structure slightly larger than the others, with a real floor and a stove. She increased his rations. She allowed him Sunday afternoons to himself. These were generous gestures by the standards of slavery, and she expected gratitude, some acknowledgement of the privilege she had extended. But Josiah accepted it all with the same stone-faced silence he had maintained throughout, his eyes revealing nothing, his labor at the forge continuing with mechanical precision. He was waiting, watching. The seeds had been planted, and now came the long season of germination. The other enslaved people on Charlton Ridge knew something had happened. though the details were whispered only in the darkest hours, in corners where no overseer could hear. They knew Josiah had been brought to the main house repeatedly. They knew the daughters were now pregnant. They knew this violated every law of nature and society the white people claimed to uphold, and yet it had occurred with the mistress's blessing. Some were horrified, some were fascinated. Some saw in it a strange, inverted justice, the masters breeding themselves into their own slaves, polluting the very purity they murdered to maintain. And some, the oldest ones who remembered Africa, nodded knowingly and said that the ancestors were at work, that what looked like submission was actually sabotage, that Josiah had not been used but had been weaponized. The children came in late summer and early autumn, each birth more difficult than Evangeline had anticipated. Cecilia labored for 23 hours, her screams echoing through the main house while the physician worked with instruments and opiates, finally extracting a son who emerged blue and silent before releasing a cry that sounded less like an infant and more like something feral. They named him Nathaniel. He was enormous, nearly 11 pounds, with a shock of black hair and eyes that were dark as river stones. Marguerite's labor was shorter but more violent. She hemorrhaged badly, the sheets soaked crimson, and for several hours it seemed she might die. Her daughter Lilith came into the world screaming with a fury that seemed impossible for something so small, her skin darker than her mother's by several shades, her features too strong to be explained away easily. Beatrice's birth was the strangest. She delivered quickly, almost easily in the early morning hours with only the elderly house servant attending. Her son Cain slipped into the world in silence, his eyes open and alert, watching. He did not cry for the first 3 days of his life, and the servants whispered that a baby who does not cry is a baby who has been here before, an old soul returned, sometimes for blessing but more often for vengeance. Evangeline dismissed such talk as superstition, but even she felt uneasy when she held Cain, when his dark infant eyes seemed to look through her rather than at her. The physician was paid handsomely and sent back to Charleston with instructions to forget everything he had witnessed. Evangeline began the carefully constructed story. A distant Ashford relative, a Mediterranean trader from generations back, explaining the children's darker coloring. She repeated it so often it became truth in her mind, the cognitive dissonance required to maintain the lie, transforming her further into something neither fully human nor fully sane. Her daughters, confined to the house during their pregnancies and now confined again during their recoveries, said nothing. They had become ghosts in their own lives, sleepwalking through motherhood, holding infants who felt like strangers. The 3 children grew rapidly, their development unsettling in its vigor. By their first birthdays, they were already walking steadily, speaking in full sentences, displaying a physical coordination that seemed impossible for their age. Nathaniel was the largest, built like his father, his hands already strong enough to grip and pull with surprising force. Lilith was wild, climbing furniture, escaping her nursery, laughing with a manic energy that exhausted her mother and terrified the servants. Cain remained the quietest, the most observing, his intelligence apparent in the way he studied everything around him with those unnervingly adult eyes, learning the patterns of the house, the hierarchies, the hypocrisies. Evangeline watched them with a mixture of pride and growing unease. They were healthy, yes, stronger than any Ashford children in 3 generations, but they were also strange. They did not behave like the docile, refined children of the planter class. They fought with each other constantly, a physical roughness that seemed imported from the quarters rather than bred in the nursery. They showed no interest in the toys and games appropriate to their station. Nathaniel was fascinated by tools and wanted to be taken to the forge. Lilith preferred the company of the enslaved children she glimpsed from windows, pressing her face against the glass and wailing to be let outside. Cain watched everything, absorbed everything, and occasionally said things no child should know, references to places he had never been, names he had never heard, as if some deep genetic memory was surfacing through him. The neighboring planters began to visit, curious about the Ashford heirs, offering tentative congratulations on the family's apparent reversal of fortune. But their visits were brief, their smiles strained. Something about the children disturbed them on an instinctive level. The proportions were wrong. The coloring could be explained, but felt suspicious. And there was something in their eyes, all three of them, that suggested a different kind of breeding entirely, something that had nothing to do with European bloodlines and everything to do with survival, resistance, and a hunger the white gentry could not name but recognized as dangerous. By the time the children reached 5 years old, the Ashford household had descended into chaos that Evangeline could no longer control or conceal. Cecilia had withdrawn entirely from motherhood, spending her days in bed with laudanum and brandy, refusing to touch or acknowledge Nathaniel, who had grown into a small giant with his father's frame and a temperament that swung between eerie silence and explosive violence. He had broken the arm of a playmate brought from a neighboring plantation, had killed the family dog with his bare hands when it snapped at him, had looked his mother in the eye afterward without remorse or comprehension of wrongdoing. Marguerite fared little better. Lilith's wildness had escalated into something clinical, something the physician called hysteria, but the servants recognized as possession, the child speaking sometimes in voices that were not her own, languages no one had taught her body seizing with fits that left her temporarily blind or paralyzed. Cain was the most dangerous precisely because he was the most controlled. He had taught himself to read by age 4, devouring every book in the house, including the ledgers, the legal documents, the records of sale and ownership that Evangeline kept locked away. He knew somehow what he was, knew the secret of his conception, knew that his grandmother had orchestrated an abomination, knew that he and his siblings were living lies. And he was planning something. The servants saw it in the way he watched the overseers, the way he lingered near conversations he should not understand, the way he had begun speaking to Josiah during the man's rare visits to the main house for metalwork, conversations conducted in glances and gestures more than words. The bloodline Evangeline had tried to save was eating itself alive. Her daughters were broken, addicted, barely functional. Her grandchildren were ungovernable, violent, strange, carrying something in them that resisted domestication, that would not be bred into submission, that recognized no master. The Ashford name was not being strengthened. It was being invaded, corrupted from within by the very vitality she had stolen, and the retribution was just beginning. Pause here, in this moment before the final unraveling, and understand what you are witnessing. This is not just a story of one plantation, one mistress, one act of grotesque calculation. This is the anatomy of how empires devour themselves, how the logic of oppression eventually turns inward, how the very cruelty used to build dynasties becomes the instrument of their destruction. Josiah knew this, the ancestors knew this, and now you know this too. If you're captivated by stories where justice arrives not through divine intervention but through the slow, inexorable consequences of human evil, where bloodlines carry memory and vengeance is written into DNA itself, then subscribe. Share this with those who understand that history's darkest chapters contain its most necessary lessons. Comment below, do you believe the children were weapons or victims? Because what comes next will challenge everything you think you know about inheritance, identity, and revenge. On the night of August 9th, 1856, Charlton Ridge burned. The fire started in 3 places simultaneously: the main house, the overseer's quarters, and the cotton storage barn, and by the time the alarm was raised, the flames had already consumed the possibility of salvation. The enslaved people fled to the fields, some helping, some watching, some singing hymns that sounded more like celebrations than prayers. The neighboring plantation sent men with buckets and horses, but the fire was too vast, too hungry, fed by something more than wood and fabric. By dawn, the main house was a blackened skeleton, the barn was ash, and 3 bodies had been pulled from the ruins. Evangeline Ashford, her throat cut before the flames took her, the head overseer, his skull crushed, and Cecilia, found in her bed, dead from laudanum overdose, whether by her own hand or another's, no one could say. Marguerite and Beatrice survived, but only in the technical sense. They were discovered in the garden, their nightgowns singed, their faces blank with shock, and they would never speak coherently again. They were sent to an asylum in Charleston where they lived another 20 years as hollow shells, painting watercolors and humming lullabies, their minds permanently fractured. The three children, Nathaniel, Lilith, and Cain, were gone, vanished. Some said they died in the fire, their bodies burned beyond recognition. Others said they saw them walking south in the smoke and darkness, three small figures holding hands, moving with purpose toward the swamps and the underground routes that led to freedom. Josiah was also gone. His cabin was empty, his tools still hanging in the forge, his presence erased as if he had never existed. The investigation was brief and inconclusive. Arson certainly, but the culprits unknown, possibly abolitionists, possibly rebellious slaves from a neighboring plantation. The case was closed. The land was sold to pay debts. The remaining enslaved people were auctioned off and scattered across 3 states, and the name Ashford, once proud and prominent, became associated not with cotton wealth but with fire, madness, and inexplicable doom. In the decades that followed, stories emerged from the quarters and the freedmen's communities, passed along in whispers and songs, transformed into legend. They said that Josiah had planned it all from the beginning, that every night he lay with those girls he was planting not just children but a curse, calling on powers older than Christianity, older than the plantations, older than America itself. They said he taught his children in secret, preparing them for the night when they would walk through fire and emerge untouched, when they would take back what had been stolen by taking everything. They said Nathaniel grew up to be a blacksmith in Philadelphia, that he made weapons for John Brown's raid and chains that he melted down as a ritual. They said Lilith became a root woman in New Orleans, that men who tried to own her died mysteriously, their bodies found drained and withered. They said Cain learned law and used it like a knife, destroying white families through litigation and debt, always working from the shadows, never using his real name. Whether these stories were true or simply the wishes of the oppressed given narrative form, no one could say for certain. But what was undeniable was the pattern that followed the Ashford bloodline, or what remained of it. Distant cousins who inherited, fragments of the estate died young, their children stillborn or deformed. Families who married into what was left of the Ashford name found themselves bankrupted within a generation, their fortunes evaporating, their reputations destroyed by scandals and accusations they could not escape. It was as if the blood itself had become toxic, as if Josiah's contribution had not strengthened the line but poisoned it at the root, introducing something that could not coexist with the parasitic logic of plantation aristocracy. The mechanism was unclear, whether genetic, spiritual, or simply the weight of transgression made manifest, but the result was absolute. By 1900, there were no Ashfords left in South Carolina. The family name existed only in courthouse records, cemetery stones, and the cautionary tales that old black women told their granddaughters about the wages of trying to steal strength from those you have already stolen everything else from. In 1934, a historian from Columbia University named Dr. Margaret Thornhill was researching antebellum plantation records when she discovered Evangeline Ashford's journal in a sealed trunk at the South Carolina Historical Society. The journal contained 87 pages of meticulous documentation, dates, cycles, observations about the pregnancies, and most damningly, explicit descriptions of the breeding program Evangeline had orchestrated. Dr. Thornhill was horrified. She brought the journal to her department head, arguing that it represented a crucial piece of evidence about the intersection of slavery, eugenics, and the depths of plantation depravity. The department head read it, paled visibly, and locked it in his safe. He told Dr. Thornhill that publishing such material would be inflammatory, that it would hurt race relations, that some historical truths were better left buried. She resigned in protest, but the journal remained sealed. It surfaced again in 1968 during the height of the civil rights movement, when a young black scholar named James Crawford gained access to the archives and photocopied every page before the university could stop him. He published excerpts in a radical history journal, and the Ashford story exploded into public consciousness. White historians called it exaggerated, possibly fabricated, a propaganda piece designed to demonize the South. Black scholars recognized it immediately as truth, not because the specifics of Evangeline's plan were common, but because the underlying logic was endemic. The use of enslaved bodies for breeding was not aberration, but industry standard. What made the Ashford case unusual was only that a white woman had applied that logic to her own daughters, crossing the racial boundary in the opposite direction, revealing the system's total moral bankruptcy. Crawford traced genealogical records and found scattered descendants, people with fragments of the story in their family oral histories. He found a man in Detroit who claimed to be Nathaniel's grandson, a woman in Atlanta who said her grandmother was Lilith, a professor in Boston who had documents suggesting Cain had indeed become a lawyer and died wealthy and anonymous. The truth was diffuse, scattered across geography and time, but the pattern remained consistent. The children of that unholy union had survived, had thrived in ways their white relatives could not, had turned their mixed blood into armor rather than shame. In 1972, a collection of letters surfaced at an estate sale in upstate New York, purchased for $2 by an antique dealer who recognized the age of the paper. Among them was a single letter dated 1863, written in careful script, signed only with the letter J. It was addressed to "My children, wherever you walk." The letter had never been sent, perhaps never intended to be, but had been preserved by someone who understood its significance. In it, the writer, almost certainly Josiah, explained everything. He wrote that he had not wanted to touch those girls, that every night in those rooms had been an exercise in maintaining his humanity while committing an act that violated everything he believed. But he had also understood that he was being given an opportunity that no enslaved man should refuse, the chance to plant himself inside the master's house, to become an ancestor to children who would be raised with privilege and education, who would have access to power, and who would carry in their very cells the memory of what had been done to their father's people. He wrote that he had spoken to each child in secret before the fire, had told them who they really were, had given them the choice to burn with the old world or walk into the new one. He wrote that they had chosen fire, had helped him set it, had watched their grandmother die without flinching because they understood by then that she was not family but enemy, that the blood connection meant nothing compared to the moral chasm between them. He wrote that he had taken them north, had placed them with different families in different cities, had given them new names and new stories, but had also given them a mission: to remember, to survive, to succeed, and to ensure that every generation forward understood the cost of their existence. The letter ended with a single line in a language that scholars later identified as a Yoruba dialect. What is planted in blood grows in blood, and the harvest belongs to those who suffered the planting. Today, if you drive through South Carolina low country, past the luxury developments and golf resorts built on plantation land, you will find no marker for Charlton Ridge. The site is overgrown with kudzu and pine, the foundations barely visible beneath decades of vegetation. But in the genealogy forums and DNA testing databases, the Ashford name still appears, attached now to black families, mixed families, people who carry fragments of that bloodline and have begun piecing together the story their ancestors were forced to hide. They gather at conferences and family reunions, these descendants of Josiah and the three daughters, and they speak openly now about what was done, about the violence that conceived them, and about the strange, defiant pride they feel in having survived it, in having transformed violation into lineage, shame into strength. The academic debates continue. Geneticists discuss epigenetics and intergenerational trauma, how suffering can literally alter DNA expression, how the stress and resistance of enslaved ancestors might manifest in their descendants' bodies and minds. Historians argue about the fire, about culpability and agency, about whether Josiah was perpetrator or victim or something more complex than either word allows. Theologians discuss curse and blessing, about whether the destruction of the Ashford line was divine justice or human vengeance, or simply the inevitable mathematics of exploitation eating itself. But in the quarters that no longer exist, In the memory kept alive by those who refuse to let these stories be sanitized or forgotten, the truth is simpler and more terrible. Evangeline Ashford tried to steal strength from a man she had enslaved, and that strength destroyed her. She thought she could control the terms of creation, could engineer bloodlines like breeding horses, could use human bodies as tools without consequence, and she learned, too late in fire and madness, that some things cannot be owned, that resistance can be passed down through generations like eye color or bone structure, that the children born of her abomination would carry not her legacy but his, and that legacy was not submission but survival, not gratitude but eternal, patient, unforgiving remembrance. The bloodline she tried to save ended in ash. The bloodline she tried to exploit walks among us still unbroken,